Hey sisters! In this video I'm going to be teaching you the importance of reading the Old Testament. A lot of Christians, especially new Christians, think, do I really have to read the Old Testament? And I am going to teach you now why it's important to read the Old Testament. I would suggest to new Christians to read the Old Testament because there are a lot of things that Jesus alludes to from the Old Testament that when you're reading the New Testament, you may not understand it completely because you didn't read the Old Testament. So you may not have, I'm not saying you're not going to understand, but I would say that you would have a better understanding if you read the Old Testament. For example, there is a part in the Bible where Jesus says that the only sign that I'll give is the sign of Jonah. Well, do you know who Jonah is? Do you know what he's talking about when he's talking about the sign of Jonah? Do you understand that? Did you read Jonah? And Jonah's a very short book in the Bible. So I would definitely say read the Old Testament. And there like another example, there's a part where Jesus says, I didn't come to destroy the law, right? I came to fulfill it. I am the fulfillment of, right? Not me, but like Jesus is the fulfillment of the law of the Old Testament. He is the fulfillment of the entire Old Testament. Now, when you read that, but you haven't read the Old Testament, what does that mean to you when he says, I'm the fulfillment of the Old Testament? What does that mean if you haven't read it? Like, I think it would be more significant for you if you read the Old Testament and then when you see or when you read him say, when you see that he says, I am the fulfillment of the law, I am the fulfillment of the prophets, I'm the fulfillment of the Old Testament. When you really understand the Old Testament and what the worship of God was like before Jesus came, and then he comes and he says, I'm the fulfillment of the Old Testament, basically is what he's saying, that's gonna, I think, sink in a lot better, and I think it's gonna be really profound when you hear him say that, if you understand if you've read the Old Testament and you understand that, when he goes ahead and says in the New Testament, I'm the fulfillment of everything in the Old Testament, right? It's just going to be a lot more rich when you hear him say that, and it's just so much better. I mean, when you see the way that it was required to, the way God required worship of him before Jesus, by reading the Old Testament, you're going to have a greater appreciation for who Jesus is and what he's done for humanity. In all, I would absolutely, do you have to read the Old Testament? You don't have to do anything, right? But for me, you're a new Christian, I would say yes, absolutely, read the Old Testament, because you're going to have, as I just said, a greater appreciation for who Jesus is and what he's done for humanity. 100%. The way I did it when I became when I was a new Christian, I would read the New Testament in the morning and then I would read the Old Testament at night. Don't think you can't understand the Old Testament. The Old Testament, if you're asking this question because you're a little bit intimidated by it or whatever, the Old Testament has the coolest stories, especially if you like action movies and stuff like that. There's tons of action going on in the Old Testament, and there are a lot of really beautiful stories in the Old Testament. My favorite being the story of Joseph that you read in Genesis, at the end of Genesis. So the Old Testament has so many cool stories, so many fun stories, tons of action, and the Old Testament is so beautiful, and I would highly recommend for you to read the Old Testament.